Hello and welcome to Superbia Spotlights. My name's Greg Thorpe. I'm the project manager for Superbia, which is the arts and culture programme from Manchester Pride, and we support and curate and fund LGBTQ projects and artists all year round. The Spotlights is a new series where we profile some of our favourite Manchester artists. We commission some new work. We have interviews like the one we're having today, and we just shine a spotlight as best we can onto some of the incredible artists in our community. And today is our special guest is the writer and novelist Okechukwu Nzelu. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I just want to start by saying congratulations, because you are the recent recipient of a Betty Trask Award, which is a prize for debut novelists under 35. It's a really exciting milestone for a debut novelist, I guess. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's huge. Honestly, it is just this wonderful encouragement. I mean, as you say, it's a prize for debut novelists under the age of 35. And I wasn't expecting it. I had no idea it was coming until my publisher called me up. And as I was saying to you earlier, the fact that I'm working on my second novel now, it's just this wonderful encouragement, especially in this period of isolation when all the highs and lows of writing become so magnified. I've just been kind of, that kind of oh, this is actually quite good. No, that's terrible. Oh, this is brilliant. Why are you writing a novel? You step away from that laptop. What do you think you're doing? You can't write. You can't read. Oh my, well, this is genius. Like, that has all been like 1,000 times made worse. So this is really nice encouragement just coming out of the blue. Actually, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and I guess because writing is kind of a solitary thing, like you don't often have that other voice in the room. The voices are all coming from yourself. So once your novel do you know what I mean? Once your novel takes place in the world, that must be such a strange experience for it to be out there, for it to be read and discussed and noticed. It's what you always want. But then is there a sense of trepidation as well around that?
Definitely. I felt, so it's been out since October 2019, no, October last year. And I remember I'm used to it now, but I felt so exposed for the first few months. I felt like I was walking around naked in public and people were being like, oh, you have that scar there. And you know what I mean? Like I felt very vulnerable in a way that I'd never felt before, and now I'm used to it and I can receive the gift of it, of having my work out there. But at first it was this terrifying, I can't even communicate how scary it was and how scared I was and how vulnerable I felt in a way that made it quite hard to enjoy, actually. But I've got used to it now, and it's lovely to be able to take the good from it, especially this thing like Betty Trask. It's just
incredible. And actually that kind of neatly segues into my next question, because it's about being an artist, really. So can you explain for us what moved you to want to write fiction in the first place, and what continues to move you, I guess?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's partly just habit and instinct together. I've always written as long as I could hold a pen. It's just something that I've always done. And I'm a teacher now, and I teach English in high school. And one of the things I learned in my training is that narrative is something that comes very natural to the human mind. If you ask a child to just write something, if they don't simply say, what am I writing? They will write a story by nature. That's what humans do. And I think it's how humans to things, it's how humans express themselves. It's just what I've always done. And then as I've practiced and I've sort of experimented as I've got older, I've found what I want to do with that. And it's different with every project that you take on. Like a short story will be different from a novel, will be different from the articles that I write. And for me, the novel that I've written and the one I'm working on, they're both about, I have a kind of a mission with both of them, I guess. With the first novel, with Nnenna and Maloney, it was all about empathy and trying to demonstrate and explore the interconnectedness of human experience, which is why there are so many characters from different backgrounds, different experiences, And, you know, we've got a character who's half Nigerian, half English. We've got a character who is a single mum. We've got a character who is gay and black, and all of those might not necessarily be the most obvious connections, but I really liked having that opportunity to link them and to show how they can be and are linked in life and how people connect with each other. And that's definitely a thread throughout all the work that I want to do.
Yeah.
But it came through really strongly, I think, in that first book, which I'm really proud of. I really like the idea that when I'm writing, I'm trying to achieve something bigger than just putting pen to paper, which I think is what all writers do.
Yeah, I mean, like that power of narrative, it runs through so many aspects of our life, like the stories that we tell each other about who we are, in our dreams, like in our memoirs, and I mean, it's everywhere. So to be able to take charge of it and produce new worlds and new insights is like, it's really exciting. And you do it so well. I'm gonna show the book, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. And you've talked a little bit about the characters. Can you, without giving too many spoilers, just summarize what the novel is about?
Yeah, so the novel is about Nnenna Maloney, who is a 16-year-old living in Manchester with her single mum. And Nnenna is half Nigerian, but she lives with her single mum who's white, and she's never met her dad. And she doesn't know why. And when a sort of an offhand comment from Nnenna's boyfriend sort of triggers her to start looking into her dad's history, into her Nigerian background, into the language, because she's a prodigy at French but doesn't speak any Igbo. This sort of, it distances her from her mother. She and her mother have this very close, tender relationship that becomes strained when she tries to these difficult questions that her mum really doesn't want to talk about. And the novel is about Nnenna and her mother learning about themselves and about each other, and what comes of that in the end. It's also about us as readers learning about them. It's also about us learning about Jonathan, who is a Jamaican man, a man of Jamaican origin, who's British, who's also living in Manchester. He's a friend of Joni's, and he is really struggling in his love life and having some awful experiences. And it's about his journey to, well, I won't spoil it, but it's about his journey.
Yeah, beautifully summarized.
Right.
Minimal spoilers. That was really fun. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed most about this novel, and that you've touched on already, is that we get to see this fascinating cross-section of relationships, and actually a complicated group of people over time who are kind of loving and relating to one another across difference, and what that really feels like on a person rather than like a structural basis. And so it feels quite intimate. So as you mentioned, we have a white parent and a mixed race black daughter. We have friendships between people of different sexualities and between men and women. All of these things that I think are quite underexplored still in fiction, certainly. And actually, it's probably in like relationship dramas on television where we've seen those more often. But in fiction, I feel like those relationships are still quite rare. And there's also relationships between people who have a Christian faith and people who don't. So there's like difficult and quite tender conversations to be had. And so when I was thinking about how I would summarize the novel, that's what really stood out to me, is that people loving and relating to each other as best they can across difference. And that's what was so powerful to me. Do you think that's a fair summary of what's going on in Nnenna Maloney?
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like that summary of it, because what the novel is trying to do is, you know, I think it's, you're right. I think as a country, as a nation, as a society, we are getting more used to these kinds of relationships that maybe cross boundaries in other mediums, perhaps in TV or film, or even in the media, in terms of the news media. Meghan Markle, her name, the name that launched 1,000 headlines, like it's something that I think we're used to in other forums, but I think as a novel, what I wanted to do was to explore the way that these things work out on a very individual, personal level. Won't necessarily be the same for everybody. Nnenna's experience is very unique, I would imagine. You know, I don't know anybody of Nnenna's background who's had that experience, that exact experience. But what was interesting was that some of the responses to the novel were that I got a couple of responses from people who said, "Oh, I was at the same university as Joni, and I'm you know, I'm a white woman. I also fell in love with a black man at this university, and actually we sat at the same place that they sat on that date." And you know, so even though none of the characters are based on individual people,
Yeah.
I ended up striking a chord with people I'd never met, which is the most.
That's extraordinary. I got chills actually thinking about that, because you don't know as an artist what that's going to summon up. And it's already kind of manifesting other people's lives, those experiences. That's really touching, actually, and kind of magical. And another thing that I found really powerful and that I really sat with for a while was that we get to experience kind of the process and the emotions of racism, actually, from inside Nnenna's mind. So inside the mind of a really young woman. And there's these really vulnerable moments that I just think are so well crafted, where Nnenna is experiencing this anxiety of projected racism. So not experiential, but it's like the scars of what it leaves. So like, why are they sitting me at this table? Like, what do they think my relationship is with this white woman who is my mother? And what do they really think about me? And what that lets us do, and I think it's especially important for white readers to experience that, is to think about like the psychology of growing up in a racist culture. I thought that was so beautifully and carefully put together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you've picked up on that. I really wanted to portray the emotional side of racism. So often, racism is something that we talk about in theory, or we talk about in terms of legislation or in terms of physical damage. And partly that's because these things are really important. You know, laws matter. They're not the answer to all the problems by any means, but they matter. And I think partly it's because we don't necessarily have the literacy to talk about emotions in the same way. And also it's because talking about emotions, I think, makes us feel vulnerable in a way that we don't always want to be as oppressed groups. But I think it's really important to shine a light on the emotional experiences of people behind, you know, the theory and behind the physical violence, behind the legislation. At the heart of all that is the human heart, and I wanted to portray what that's like for somebody who is in a really vulnerable position. Nnenna's very young. She's not. I, as an adult, I have defenses and resources that Nnenna won't have. You know, I have vocabulary for things that she perhaps doesn't. I have years of experience that she doesn't. And interestingly, it was also something that I was trying to do with Jonathan as well. When we see Jonathan, he's in most of the time that we see Jonathan, he's in this really toxic relationship with an awful white man who treats him terribly. And that's all written through first person monologues. We only hear his side of the conversation. Yeah. I did that deliberately because I wanted it to be impossible to look away. I didn't want it to become a conversation about white guilt or white fragility. I wanted it to be impossible to look away. I wanted to say, look at this person's pain, look at this person's experience, look at this person's suffering. That is what needs to be listened to and upheld and engaged with, not anything else, not right now.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that really works so well with those passages with Jonathan, because it's like bearing witness, and it's not muddied by anyone else's input, like you say. And also because it has this kind of droll, a comedy element to it as well, which is like, I mean, it's like pure pathos. And he's such a vulnerable person. And it made me think, not just about Jonathan, actually, but I was thinking about Bell Hooks and the way that she talks about why culture is important. I mean, she's a really kind of intense, brilliant theorist, but she's very interested in culture of all kinds, popular culture and popular literature. And it's because she talks about where the ways that we have to image ourselves really impact on us. And one of the things I love is that I feel like there's not always a diversity of images. And Bell Hooks talks particularly about where is the young Black woman who is committed to her books and her writing, who is intellectual and inquisitive, and all of those, you know, the image that she made for herself. And where do we have that in popular culture? And I feel like Nnenna sits so beautifully in that space. Do you know what I mean? She's got this ambition and this drive that's beyond her. She's got this incredible, like, inquisitive mind, not just for learning and imagining her future, but learning about herself. You know, it's unstoppable, that attraction towards her roots and everything. And I feel like she occupies this really original place. Do you think that's important? And do you see that for Nnenna?
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. And yeah, I think the point you made about bell hooks is so important. I think as a writer, I guess I think of I'm drawn to the word vocabulary rather than images, but I think they're saying the same thing. Yeah. Because you're right. I think that if you can't, you know, I guess the idiom is, it's hard to be it if you don't see it, and I think that's true. It's a point that was made about Half of the Yellow Sun. I think that was so brilliant because when Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie wrote that book, you know, it's about the Biafran War or the Nigerian Civil War, depending on how it's talked about. And, you know, this is something that it really wasn't talked about at all. It was such a traumatic event for so many people. People of my parents' generation just couldn't talk about it. My dad lived through it, and it was something that he never spoke about, except very, very rarely in oblique reference. And that book gave people a vocabulary to be able to talk about their experiences in a way that hadn't really been done before, and it opened up that conversation. You know, your point about bell hooks is so right. It reminded me of the beginning of Middlemarch, when she's talking about how women, especially, like, you can only fit into the roles that you've been given a lot of the time for women. She's saying that, you know, if you don't have an example of a life before you, or if you don't have the opportunities in front of you, what do you pour your life energy into? Where does that go to? And then, of course, that's why Dorothy is so frustrated. And yeah, I really wanted to look into the nooks and crannies of human experience. I wanted to look at who is vulnerable, like people, especially people who are vulnerable for all sorts of reasons, but also people who are brilliant in certain ways and just on the edge of something in certain ways, and or people who really struggle to communicate in certain ways. So I'm really glad that you enjoyed that, because that was a
really loved it. And also what I love about Nnenna is like that exuberance and the messiness of youth, coupled with this kind of impossible ambition. But because the novel has these two really clever timelines, you also get to see Joni, Nnenna's mother, as a young woman not much older than Nnenna. So you get this beautiful disarming process where you're like, guess what? Grown-ups don't know what they're really doing either. And so each character goes through this different process of humanization. That's why I love the opening quote so much. Here it is, the heart, from Gerard Manley Hopkins, because that's what really gets down to the matter. And especially with Jonathan as well, because again, we don't always have that figure of the unique and vulnerable Black man in literature, and certainly not in popular culture. So he goes through that process of humanization for the reader in a really unique way. And so you get all of these very close-up moments that just has this like wonderful cumulative effect, I think. Especially for readers who love character, because I mean, I'm really motivated by character. So really, really rewarding in that sense. And what I just want to divert the conversation a little bit, because we've been talking about themes like absent parents and racism and kind of family friction. There's also things about like untold immigrant stories in there, and class friction and all of these things. And I just want to like let readers know that this is also a really funny novel. Like, it sounds like, because the themes are complex and quite heavy, like it's a really refreshing and funny novel. And I just wanted to ask you, like, what does comedy and what does it allow you to do, and why do you use that as a tool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Comedy was, in a lot of ways, a great and a horrible medium to write in. I redrafted this novel so many times, and after the third or second redraft, I redrafted it specifically to make it funny. And it was great because comedy is a very good, very strict barometer of writing. You can't, most people find it very hard to laugh if they're also, if they are suffering for a character, or if a character is not being treated correctly by the author, not necessarily by the other characters. If there is prejudice or if there is cruelty going on in a novel, it's quite hard to laugh. I think for comedy to work, you have to be reasonably comfortable, which isn't to say that you can't disrupt and that you can't challenge characters, that characters can't be in uncomfortable situations. But I think comedy sort of forces you to do a lot of things right in order for it to be set up properly. So it was quite useful in that way. And I wrote it, as a comedy because I really enjoyed it, and I loved that it was good for me to have a good time with it. But also comedy, I think, because it's a very British type of comedy, I'm inspired by people like Zadie Smith. White Teeth was a huge influence for me, by Nick Hornby as well, and also Salman Rushdie, who of course is not just British, but it's a type of comedy which I think stems from the fact that as British people, if you try and get us to talk about our emotions head on, or even to listen to discussion about them head on, we get very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But comedy sort of allowed me to sort of sugar the pill a little bit. So what I often do is have a funny moment which gives way to a more serious observation, or a funny moment which leads to a realization about something in a kind of a quieter way that just has its own weight and can do its own job. And I really enjoyed having that mix of things because it meant that I could say what I wanted to say while also having fun and not feeling like I was making it too heavy. Because you're right, the novel does some heavy lifting in terms of its themes. There's big things like race, gender, sexuality, mental health, religion, and class. There's some heavy stuff, but I wanted to have both the fun and the heavy sitting alongside.
And it works really nicely. It's such a kind of powerful thing to have on your palette is humour. And I think when it works best, it's between quite often the verbal sparring, which I really enjoyed. But it is, like you say, particularly British kind of dry, droll, sarcastic. And it's about keeping someone just slightly at bay. Do you know what I mean? Because you're not quite ready to say what you want to say. And then when that gives way to something else, to something more real, the contrast is really beautiful. And being funny is hard on paper because it's idiosyncratic to each of the characters, but it lets the reader know how well you know the character, and so you feel like you're in really safe hands. So I really enjoyed that. It must be like being under the spotlight, literally sharing all of these insights about writing and stuff. So thank you for being so generous. And there's so much to be enjoyed with this novel, and I feel like with a really, really good piece of cinema, everybody can see themselves somewhere and has a role to play in the reading of the novel. And I think that's really hard to make work. So just well done. It's really, really exciting to read. So I want to ask you just a couple of last questions, more about kind of writing. And why do you think the novel has this form that we're still so in love with? Why do you think it endures and has endured so well?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think it partly goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is the instinctive nature of narrative. I think it's something that humans lean towards naturally. We use stories to be able to make sense of things. We tell stories in order to reorganize the world slightly in order to give our slant on things. Even example of a eulogy, my friend gave a eulogy at her grandma's funeral recently, and it was partly a narrative. It was, here's how she grew up, here's how she came to this country, here is what she was like in her old age just before she died. I think it's our way of highlighting certain things. And certainly when I'm writing in The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney, what I was doing was bringing out things that we wouldn't necessarily hear you know, or get to see in theatre, for example, in cinema. Most of the time, all you know is what the characters can say for themselves. You're limited by how much the characters can advocate for themselves, but a novel frees you from that. Yeah. And especially when you're dealing with something that spans decades or several years, it gives you that freedom to talk about how people change over time. And I think that is something that's really comforting, because there aren't a huge amount of other ways for us to see that sort of projected or forecast for ourselves. We don't necessarily get to understand ourselves in the long span of life, or people that we care about in the long span of life, unless we happen to be very, very close to them and they're very good at articulating it for themselves. A novel frees you up to give somebody that experience and that explanation a lot more.
Yeah, and that sense of change, I think, is so key, because it's kind of quite a loving thing to be able to see someone change and to still, you know, accept them. And especially when their role in life changes. So like when Joni becomes a parent, like the future that she's imagined for herself is gone. And so we see her through this, you know, these 2 points of view, from Nnenna as the daughter and herself and what she hoped for herself. And that's quite a loving thing, to be able to witness someone change and just to hold on to that experience. I love that. I love that explanation. Thank you. And just before we sign off, I wonder, could you recommend for our viewers one other novel that you would highly recommend for them to maybe read in lockdown? One that you've really enjoyed or has impacted you?
Does it have to be just one?
Yeah, you can go for more than one. We've got plenty of time in our hands.
I couldn't narrow it down to just one, because there are two I loved so much. One is called Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendes, which is this beautifully, beautifully told story of a young man who is a Jehovah's Witness, who is from a working class community, and who is disowned by his family when it becomes apparent that he's gay, and this young black man moves to London and has this life, which I won't spoil for you, but it follows his ups and downs, and it is so beautifully told. The prose is just really, really well balanced. And the other novel I want to recommend is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. She's an American author, and her novel is this, again, the prose is just so beautiful. And it's a fascinating story, again, of quite unique people in quite unique circumstances. It follows two sisters who grow up in America and who are black but light enough to pass. And the story follows what happens when one of them decides to pass as white and the other one does not. And they split up and they have these sort of separate lives. And it follows their separate lives and their families. And it's really wise and knowing, but also just really beautifully told. So those two novels I'd really recommend.
Incredible. Thank you so much for those recommendations. And I'm already thrilling at the idea of possible conversation around those books. That would be really exciting. And those are both brand new authors to my ears. So thank you so much. That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to recommend everybody buy, gift, share, read a copy of The Private Joes of Nnenna Maloney by Okechukwu and Nzelu from the wonderful Dialogue Books. Thank you again for joining us. Stay tuned for the rest of Superbia Spotlights. We'll be producing a new one each week, hopefully beyond the end of lockdown. And thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.